Thank you very much, Olivia. I know it's a busy time of the semester, and glad that you took the time out to join us today. We're delighted to welcome to BYU Professor Caren Frost from the University of Utah. She will be speaking today on Middle Eastern refugee women resettling in Utah, exploring the strengths and challenges for integration. Professor Frost is the director of the Center for Research on Migration and Refugee Integration at the University of Utah, and is a research professor at the U's College of Social Work. She does a lot of work with refugee women. She has extensive experience in Morocco. She's lived multiple years in Morocco, and is a qualitative researcher who does a lot of work to try to really understand what is going on when a refugee resettles. What do they go through? How do you measure the ability of that refugee to integrate into a society in a way that helps them to thrive and helps them to enrich that society? This is an issue that is of great intellectual interest to scholars of multiple disciplines. It's of great intellectual interest to me as a political scientist and as someone who cares a lot about the Middle East. It's an important question in social work and in development. It's also a question that I think goes beyond just intellectual interest. I think as we think about the mission of the university, of which we're a part, and we think about the ways in which we engage with the world, sometimes that means just going out into the world and exploring it and understanding it in ways that enrich us and allow us to enrich the parts of the world that we come into contact with. But the world comes here too. And the ways in which we interact with a diverse set of profiles that come to Utah, I think, is a really, really important question that this university cares a lot about. And so we're really delighted to welcome Professor Frost to come and share some of her research, some of her thoughts about that with us. She's also going to introduce a little bit about the center that she directs and the kind of things that they are engaged in that make a difference on this issue. So please join me in welcoming Professor Caren Frost. At the end of her remarks, which will be in about 40 minutes, we will have some time for questions, and I'm not going to stand up between now and then, but we have a mic here, and if you would be willing to come up and introduce yourself, what you're studying at BYU, if you're a student here, or your background a little bit, and then ask those questions. We will go until 5:30 today. Professor Frost.
Great, thank you. Okay, can everybody see me? Okay, I'm kind of short. Okay, anyway, sometimes I have to stand on a little box so people can see me. Anyway, thank you, Professor Meekum. I appreciate you inviting me down to do this. I'm very excited to see everybody in the room and talk about some of the work that we're doing and talk about some of the health and mental health needs for refugee women from the Middle East who are coming to Utah, okay? Sorry, you took a picture and I took a drink. I'm so sorry. Okay, so I think that what I would like to do is we'll just go ahead and move through the talk, but if there's something that is completely unclear, please raise your hand and tell me, okay? Because sometimes, we get jargonistic about the things that we talk about, and it's clear to us, but it may not be clear to anybody else in the audience, okay? So, as Professor Meekum mentioned, I am the director of the Center for Research on Migration and Refugee Integration at the University of Utah. It's a relatively new center. We're about some years old. August 2016 was when we opened our doors, which is actually my office, okay? And we have three aims for our center, and the first one is about academics and how we're looking at classes, what's being taught, are there gaps in classes and that kind of thing? And we're hoping to branch out and look at what other universities are doing so we can really identify what are things that are working really well for students, how is information really coming at people, what are the gaps for the things that we're discussing. The second aim of our center is about outreach, and one of the things that we do every summer is we have students from refugee or immigrant backgrounds who would be first-generation students coming to university. We have a program where they come up and they spend about 2 or 3 hours with us on campus, and then they rotate around and spend time in other departments so that they can see that the university is not a scary place, and we really want them to go to university. And as we say, it doesn't matter what university or community college you go to one, okay? So we're trying to really promote that with students. And the final piece is that we do research. And 2 or 3 areas that we're interested in, we're working on in terms of our research is one is about integration, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. And the second one is about looking at secondary migration. And then the third area is really looking at health, mental health and physical health for refugees who are arriving in the state of Utah. Okay, so anyway, that's a little bit about the center. And I think we'll just go ahead and get started. Okay? Okay, so I just pushed the little button. And you know it isn't going to work because now I'm standing up here. Right? Oh, there we go. Yay. Okay. So I identified a number of discussion points that we're going to go over today. The first one is we're going to really talk about newly arriving refugee groups coming from the Islamic world, coming to the United States, and specifically in Utah. We're going to talk a little bit about the concept of integration and what does that mean. We'll explore some challenges that people face when they are resettling, and then we'll talk about the strengths that many refugee women bring to resettlement as they're coming to the state of Utah. And finally, we'll just sort of go over some ideas for what you can do to interact with refugee women and how you can help the resettlement process for them become a little bit easier. Okay? All right, so this is a wonderful Pew Research slide. Okay, I shamelessly cut it off with snipping tool and put it in my slide, you know. But what it really does for us is it really shows us the different waves of oh, it shifted to me. Ooh, that's so weird. Okay. It shows the different waves of refugees coming into the United States over time, so that you can see, you know, in the 1970s, these would be people coming in from Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, those groups would be coming in. And then what we see in 1999 is that we see a lot of people coming in from Kosovo, right? And then we see in 2004 people coming in from Somalia, Cuba, and Laos. And now we are up to about 2008 and forward. And what we're really seeing is a lot of people who are coming in from Asia, specifically people who are from Burma, people who are from some sub-Saharan African countries like Somalia, Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And then we also see people coming in from the Middle East, specifically in Iran, Iraq, okay, and Syria, and a number of people we see coming up from Latin and South America too, okay? So anyway, this just sort of gives us an idea where people are coming from. And if we think about people who come and arrive in the United States, in 2016, about half of the arrivals who are refugees coming to the United States were either from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Syria, or Burma. Okay, and Burma is really Myanmar, and that's been a lot in the news right now, especially with what's going on with the Rohingya community. About a month ago, we had a discussion about the Rohingya community and what's going on there, and one of the members, one of the leaders, was actually one of our speakers. It was a really wonderful discussion about what they had experienced and the fact that his family, many of his family members are still back there in Myanmar, and they can't get here, and it's very distressing for him. In 2016, fiscal year 2016, about 85,000 refugees were settled in the United States, and almost half of them were Muslim. Okay, in fiscal year 2019, in the United States, we're only going to be able to resettle about 30,000 because that's the new federal mandate, and there will be a lot less people who are from the Islamic world because of the executive orders and the travel ban on that. Okay. The largest groups coming in for fiscal year 2019 will be people from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Syrians, as well as people from Eritrea. Okay, and Eritrea is a little tiny country off the coast of, it's up above by Ethiopia, okay, just so everybody knows where we are, okay? I once did a map test in one of my classes, and I said, what is this country? And everybody said, oh, this country, I think I can even point at it. Can I do it? This country is Italy. So this is why I try to really get us to think about where we are on our map, okay? It's like, not quite, okay. Really close, begins with an I, okay. Okay. The largest Muslim groups that are coming into the United States are people from Syria, Iraq, Somalia, Iran, and Afghanistan. Okay, and actually, believe it or not, Utah does resettle a number of people from Afghanistan. I think that's not a country we normally think of for a refugee resettlement, but there's a big group here in the state of Utah. Let's see, what else do I need to say? Nothing there. You know, you write your notes, and sometimes you think it's all really pithy, but when you get up here, probably not so much. Okay, so this is what it looks like for the major countries of refugee resettlement in Utah. So what you see is that purple is the countries where people have been resettled, come in and be resettled previous to 2014. Okay, refugees in the sort of the gray, the green, whatever color that happens to be for us. This like right here. These are the groups that are currently being resettled. Okay, and then. Yeah, and then the orange is the country where people step in first and ask for asylum, okay? So we'll talk a little bit about the difference between displaced persons, okay? So then we have internally displaced persons, we have refugees, and we also have asylum seekers, and we'll talk about those in just a minute. So Utah, from 2012 to 2017, resettled about 7,020 refugees. 54% of them were men, when 46% of them thus were women. In 2016, we had 954. And I remember when we were having the discussion about how are we going to resettle all of these people, because the resettlement agencies, which are Catholic Community Services and the International Rescue Committee, we have two in the state, they were not quite prepared to handle the influx of people coming in, okay? And then in 2018, we only had about 500 people resettled between the two agencies. So now what they're worried about is they're losing funding and they're having to let people go with the hopes that at some point the federal mandate will change and we will be able to accept more people into the United States. So I just need to say that decisions made at the federal level have a big impact on what happens in our state about, funding and how people get jobs and that kind of thing. In case you didn't already know that. Okay. All right. So I think one of the questions that we really need to answer is, who is a refugee, right? So in the world, there are about 68 million displaced persons, okay? 68 million people have been removed somehow from their home, okay? 40 million of these people are what we call internally displaced persons, all right? So these would be people who had to move because of war and conflict in their own country, but they are still within their own country's borders, all right? 25 million of these people are categorized as refugees, all right? And 3 to 5 million people are categorized as asylum seekers, okay? So when we think about people who are refugees, a refugee is someone, based on the UN definition in 1951, who has been forced to flee his or her country because of persecution, war, or violence. In other words, they had to flee their country. They're not still in their country, they have moved elsewhere, okay? They have a well-founded fear that they're going to be persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, member in a social group. I think this definition is particularly pertinent and is received quite well in the state of Utah, because I know that is the landscape for which people who are LDS came to Utah too. It's the same kind of thing, right? So people who are refugees, you have to apply to become a refugee. You cannot just wake up one day, contrary to things you might hear, and say, this morning, I'm going to be a refugee. I'm going to get on a plane, I'm going to go to the United States, and they're going to just accept me because I'm a refugee. It isn't how it works, okay? You have to apply to be a refugee. And we only resettle people in the United States who are refugees who have applied through the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and have been given that status to be a refugee, okay? So it's not just a thing that you do, okay? I have a little 6-minute TED Talk that really highlights what it is to be a refugee. Do you think we can show that? Okay. Can we show that? I don't know how to do that. I can't do that from here. Oh my gosh, magic fingers. Okay. Okay. Am I supposed to do something from here for that?
Who have been forced to leave their
okay.
homes to escape
There we go. We got it.
Violence and persecution.
Louder.
The majority of them have become internally
Great.
displaced persons, which means they have fled their homes but are still within their own countries. Others have crossed a border and sought shelter outside of their own countries. They are commonly referred to as refugees. But what exactly does that term mean? The world has known refugees for millennia, but the modern definition was drafted in the UN's 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees in response to mass persecutions and displacements of the Second World War. It defines a refugee as someone who is outside their country of nationality and is unable to return to their home country because of well-founded fears of being persecuted. That persecution may be due to their race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion, and is often related to war and violence. Today, roughly half the world's refugees are children, some of them unaccompanied by an adult, a situation that makes them especially vulnerable to child labor or sexual exploitation. Each refugee's story is different, and many must undergo dangerous journeys with uncertain outcomes. But before we get to what their journeys involve, let's clear one thing up. There's a lot of confusion regarding the difference between the terms migrant and refugee. Migrants usually refers to people who leave their country for reasons not related to persecution, such as searching for better economic opportunities or leaving drought-stricken areas in search of better circumstances. There are many people around the world who have been displaced because of natural disasters, food insecurities, and other hardships. But international law, rightly or wrongly, only recognizes those fleeing conflict and violence as refugees. So what happens when someone flees their country? Most refugee journeys are long and perilous, with limited access to shelter, water, or food. Since the departure can be sudden and unexpected, belongings might be left behind, and people who are evading conflict often do not have the required documents like visas to board airplanes and legally enter other countries. Financial and political factors can also prevent them from traveling by standard routes. This means they can usually only travel by land or sea and may need to entrust their lives to smugglers to help them cross borders. Whereas some people seek safety with their families, others attempt passage alone and leave their loved ones behind with the hopes of being reunited later. This separation can be traumatic and unbearably long. While more than half the world's refugees are in cities, sometimes the first stop for a person fleeing conflict is a refugee camp, usually run by the United Nations Refugee Agency or local governments. Refugee camps are intended to be temporary structures, offering short-term shelter until inhabitants can safely return home, be integrated to the host country, or resettle in another country. But resettlement and long-term integration options are often limited. So many refugees are left with no choice but to remain in camps for years and sometimes even decades. Once in a new country, the first legal step for a displaced person is to apply for asylum. At this point, they are an asylum seeker and not officially recognized as a refugee until the application has been accepted. While countries by and large agree on one definition of refugee, every host country is responsible for examining all requests for asylum and deciding whether applicants can be granted the status of refugee. Different countries' guidelines can vary substantially. Host countries have several duties towards people they have recognized as refugees, like the guarantee of a minimum standard of treatment and non-discrimination. The most basic obligation towards refugees is non-refoulement, a principle preventing a nation from sending an individual to a country where their life and freedom are threatened. In reality, however, refugees are frequently the victims of inconsistent and discriminatory treatment. They are increasingly obliged to rebuild their lives in the face of xenophobia and racism. And all too often, they aren't permitted to enter the workforce and are fully dependent on humanitarian aid. In addition, far too many refugee children are out of school due to lack of funding for education programs. If you go back in your own family history, chances are you will discover that at a certain point, your ancestors were forced from their homes, either escaping a war or fleeing discrimination and persecution. It would be good of us to remember their stories when we hear of refugees currently displaced, searching for a new home.
So do I do something now, or, oh no, somebody else does it. Oh, that's so great. Okay, so anyway, I think that gives us an idea about what that looks like, right? You just don't decide you're going to be, you have to apply to be a refugee, okay? And you actually have to be granted that status. It usually takes anywhere from 24 to 36 months minimum to get status as a refugee. And then it may take longer time period for you to be accepted and resettled in a country, okay? So that usually takes anywhere from 12 months to whatever, okay? We have people who are in a camp in Burundi who have been identified and categorized as refugees, but they've been there since 1972. Okay, so it's just, yeah, it's, anyway, I think you get that, okay. All right, so some terms I just want us to think about, and we're going to go over some definitions of these terms because I think that people get them confused, and when we're talking about integration, we're talking about something very specific, and it's not as negative or colonialist as some of the other terms that we might see, okay? So assimilation, when we're thinking about assimilation, I think we think about, well, some people might think about some of the Star Trek ones with the Borg. I don't, you guys are probably too young for that, okay. Where they say, you know, resistance is futile, you will be assimilated, which really means you're just going to give up everything about you and you're going to become one of us, right? I mean, I just think it's a perfect example because it really means that you are being subsumed in somebody else's culture, in somebody else's parameters, okay? Assimilation is really the process of adapting or adjusting to the culture of a group or nation or the state of being so adapted. You really have to give up everything about yourself because what you believe and your own values when you come in to a new country, they're not valued, okay? They're not seen as useful, all right? Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So enculturation is really an educational process, okay? So you are all being enculturated in one way or another, right, here at the university at BYU because you're in school, okay? And we want to teach you how to be productive members of society. And this doesn't necessarily have a positive or a negative connotation. It's really how you learn about your group's culture, your group's processes, and how you learn how to function, okay? So nothing negative or positive about that one. When we think about acculturation, this is a term that we used to use, and acculturation is really about, the process of adapting, but you're taking some traits from the new culture and you're maintaining some of your own, okay? But really the expectation is that the hosting or the receiving country, culture, whatever, doesn't have to do anything differently. They don't have to accept any change in themselves in order to get you to integrate into their culture, okay? Does that make sense to everybody? Yes? Okay. All right, and finally, Europe has a completely different set of terms, and I have colleagues from Finland and Germany and actually from India, and we're arguing about this, okay? They're using the term inclusion rather than integration, which we'll talk about in a minute. And what they're assuming is that integration is just simply another United States colonialist term. Okay, but the problem with the word inclusion, when we've talked about this last year, we had a conference in Germany, and I said, okay, so tell me what you mean by inclusion. And the definition was, well, we're including people. Okay, you can't have the word in the definition, okay? So we're still having arguments over the email about what they're really trying to do with this, okay? And I think they're not quite sure what they want to do with this. I just think that they don't want to use the word integration because to them it seems like it's so linked to acculturation, okay? All right. So integration is really the idea of bringing people of different racial and ethnic groups into unrestricted and equal association. And I have this feeling that the inclusion piece for my colleagues in Western Europe is really about that concept of equal association, because what we see right now is that it's not necessarily equal association for people who are coming in from a different country, okay? What we're hoping is that things will be, there will be desegregation, okay? So people aren't put in specific areas of a city where they have to live by themselves and they don't get the chance to interact with people from other countries, okay? And that the newcomer and the host receiving community are supposed to be working together to determine what are the mutual values that they have, so that they can really create a new sense of community, okay? Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. See, I think that's just a better definition. Okay. All right. So when we think about integration, we're also thinking about how people use this as, developing economic mobility. When refugees come to the United States, they are very lucky to come here because in the United States, they get to go right to work. Okay, in other countries, especially countries in countries like Hungary or countries like Germany, they don't get to go to work. So then they have to rely on other people to provide for them. Okay, in the United States, we have a real promotion about you come to the United States as a refugee. Let's get you into a job. Let's get you to learn the language, and then we'll work it all out from there. Okay, but in the United States, to a certain degree, that's kind of a detriment too, because sometimes people come in. For some people, some women from different countries, they may never have worked outside the home, and this is a whole role shift for them when they're thinking about how they're going to provide for families. Okay? Okay. It should be really an intentional process when we think about integration, so that it's not just the incoming, the newly arriving Americans, as we're calling them, coming in and giving up everything or adapting in some way. We all have to figure out how that's going to work for us too, okay? Because when you have somebody new come into your neighborhood, you have to get to know who they are. What are they doing here? Okay, so it's a two-way street when we're thinking about that, okay? Okay. Okay, so in 2004, Auger and Strang, out of the UK Home Office, put together a report about integration. And what they did here was they developed this idea of there's these 10 indicators of integration, all right? And we need to figure out how people can move through the process of becoming integrated by meeting each of these indicators. Now, this is not a linear model, okay, which is part of the problem. They presented it like it's a pyramid, but it's not a pyramid. Okay, so what we have first is we have what we're calling means and markers, okay? So that's employment, education, health, and housing. And means and markers are really the outcomes, okay? So if you can be successful in getting a job, in getting into education, getting health care, managing your health, and getting housing, okay, you're going to probably have better outcomes than people who cannot do those things, okay? The second thing is about social connections. And social connections are social links, social bonds, and social bridges, okay? When we think about this, this is really the public face of integration and shows you how linked you are to your people from your own community, people from your neighborhood, and from institutions that support you as you are trying to integrate or you're trying to get to know this new cultural entity within which you're working, okay? Okay, and then there's facilitators, and facilitators are really the mechanisms that we are thinking about for understanding how comfortable people are in this new culture, okay? So if you can't speak the language, it's going to be very hard. How many of you lived in another country where you didn't speak the word of the language particularly well when you first got there? Okay, so I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Morocco. And when I signed up for Peace Corps, they said, this is great. You have a minor in French. You get there, you're going to be able to use your French. It's going to be so good. And I'm thinking, yay, I've had 4 years of French. This is going to be so great. Okay, so we get there. And the first day of our training, they said, so if you want to speak to any woman over the age of 30, you're going to have to learn Moroccan Arabic. I am terrible with languages, okay? So the first class we went into, I was like, okay, I'm never going to get this. This is going to be so hard, okay? But I'd never heard Arabic, but now I'm fluent, okay? But it took forever to get there because I'm not that good with it. Plus, I'm an adult learner, okay? And adult learners, it takes them longer to get into learning a language. And a lot of the people that we see that are coming in and resettling in the United States, especially from some of the Islamic countries, these tend to be older women with their children, okay? They may or may not have a spouse with them. And as a consequence, they may not have learned English in their home country. It's just really, really difficult for some of them. So I would just say lesson number one, when you're working with refugees, patience about the language, okay? Because it's really hard for them and they struggle, okay? So anyway, these are the things that you need to know in order to be comfortable in the new culture, okay? And then finally, we have the foundation for anything that you want to do once you are resettled, civic engagement, okay? But you can't really be involved civically particularly well unless you have all of these other things. And if you want to run for office, what do you have to do? What do you have to be? You have to be a citizen, okay? So if you haven't got all of these things and you don't speak the language, you can't take that citizenship test because you can't pass it, okay? So I mean, there's all of these things that people have to be aware of when they're resettling, okay? Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Okay, so challenges for resettlement. So challenges for resettlement are really all about our means and markers, okay? And we talked a little bit about the language and the cultural knowledge, but it's also about safety and stability. So at the moment, we're working on a project with the Salt Lake City Police Department where Chief Brown, who's the chief of police there, would really like to have more people who are refugees or of immigrant backgrounds to become law enforcement officers. He said he thinks that if he can develop better rapport with people from refugee and immigrant communities, everybody is going to feel like they're safe, okay? They're going to feel like they're connected in some way, and they're not going to be so afraid of law enforcement when law enforcement comes in, okay? We hope that's true. So we're working on a project with him about that. And also making sure that you've got, safe housing. I chair the Refugee Women's Committee for the state, and we run workshops for women and come in and they talk about all kinds of things from, health to domestic violence to hygiene to parenting, all of those kinds of things. And when we take some of the women home, there are places where they are housed right now because it's inexpensive housing that I don't know why they would feel safe there because I certainly wouldn't, okay? So we just need to think about what we're doing when we're resettling people, okay? All right, so in the 1990s, John Barry did a whole set of work about how people acculturate. Okay, so he used an acculturation model, which of course would be, now we would call it an integration model, okay? And what he discovered was that people who don't identify with U.S. culture and don't identify with their own culture, right, they're marginalized people. Okay, because they're not connected anywhere. And we know that people who are marginalized, these are people who are going to cause us problems. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? Okay, do I need to say more about that? Okay, these are people who do shootings. Okay, these are people who send bombs. These are people who do that kind of thing because they're not connected either way. Okay, but when you get people who identify with their home culture, their heritage culture, as well as with U.S. culture, and they value pieces from both of those, these are people who are going to be integrated, and they're going to be biculturally integrated because they will have things from their own culture that they value and respect and want to keep, and things from the U.S. culture that they value and they want to learn more about, okay? Okay. So I'll just tell you a little story. My ex-husband is Moroccan. I just love him to death. Anyway, the first year we were here and we had a house, he was more American at Christmas than I was, okay? The National Lampoon Christmas Vacation where he plugs in the thing and all of the power dips? Okay, that was my house, okay? And I'm like, why are you doing this? You're Muslim. He says, yeah, but everybody else is doing it. We got to do it too because I got to show I am totally into this. And he still loves Christmas. So there are things, we celebrate Islamic holidays. We celebrate Christian holidays. And it's all of a piece for all of us because there are things he values, there are things that we value from what he does. So it's all of a piece, right? So if we can get our refugee groups to value, remember what it is their culture was all about and what they value there, as well as what could be valued in the United States, integration is going to be easier for them. Okay? Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. My poor ex-husband, he gets used for a lot of my examples. He knows, so it's okay. Okay. All right, gendered issues. So when we're looking at people from the Islamic world, there are a number of gendered issues that happen when they come here, okay? In the Islamic world, there really is still the public-private dichotomy, okay, where men are really the public persona, right, for the household, and women are more the domestic or private persona for the household. So a lot of times women would not necessarily have been working outside the home. If they do, they're going to go to work. They won't be lingering outside. They'll come back home, and their friends will come over there. So men will be sitting in cafes. Men will do different kinds of activities, okay? If you have to flee your home because you are a refugee, this is no longer true for you. Okay, so men's roles and actions change. They can no longer be the protectors of their family because that's not a role that you can manage if you're living in a refugee camp. Okay, and when you come to the United States or you're resettled somewhere, you're not the protector, you are not the knowledgeable public space person because you don't know any more about it necessarily than does anybody else in the household. Okay. There's a change in your definition of what's masculine, okay, and that has to do with being taking care of family honor, taking care of family members, and being the protector for your family. You're probably going to have, as a man, a reduced workload, okay, outside the home, because the job that you had may not be the job you can do here. We have a number of men from Syria and Iraq who are here as refugees, and they were doctors, engineers, lawyers in their home country, but their degree and their certificate doesn't transfer here. Okay, so now at the age of 55 or 60, they're going to have to go back to school to get another degree or re-up things on their diploma or their certificate. And if their language skills are not good enough, they're not going to be able to do that. Okay, so there's serious change in what happens to men when they are resettled. Okay, a lot of them are simply bored because they don't have enough to do. Okay, they feel disempowered and they're suffering from some low self-esteem. In addition, what we see for resettled men is there is a significant increase in aggression, physical aggression towards women, not only in their own communities but toward women in other communities as well. Okay. Now, women's roles, on the other hand, change drastically as well, okay? So they may have an increased workload outside the home, okay, because they can take on sometimes jobs where you didn't need to have a diploma or a certificate or a degree necessarily, okay? They then end up taking care of family and, in some cases, becoming the breadwinner at the same time. Okay, so now they're having a double pressure put on them that isn't something that they necessarily anticipated having, nor do they necessarily want. Okay, a lot of people I know have said, "Oh, well, this is great. So she will come here as a Muslim woman, and she will learn to speak English, and she will become educated, and then she can get a job outside the home. Isn't that great?" That may not be what she wants. Okay, and we should not have that expectation that that's what she wants. Okay. They may experience higher levels of interpersonal violence that we just talked about. Also, a lot of people who are refugees from the Islamic world, age at marriage is much younger when there are conflict, when there's conflict and war going on, because a lot of families think that if I marry my daughter off to someone who's older, he will take care of her, and I won't have to worry about her getting hurt in some way. Okay, so we see rates of child marriage go way up when we see refugees from the Islamic world. Okay, arranged marriages are increasing for the same reason, and then there are a number of things called what we will call a mut'a marriage, and a mut'a marriage is a temporary marriage, and it can be for one night, and it can be for 99 years. Okay, but it's not a real marriage because it's not permanent. Okay, which puts women at risk for a number of other things. Okay, that makes sense to everybody? Yeah.
What's the purpose of a mutual marriage?
So it used to be a mut'a marriage was one where people could have sex, okay? And it was married sex, okay? And then it really just sort of a gateway for a lot of women for prostitution, okay? That was one of the reasons, okay? Another reason is sometimes in order to get married, you have to pay bride price, and then you have to have an engagement, and then you get married later, and there's more money that goes with that. And a lot of times people simply don't have those kinds of finances to do that. So you can simply sign the contract that says your mut'a marriage is 99 years. Okay, so yeah, just depends. Okay, good question. Okay. So, in terms of mental health needs for many of our people coming in from the Islamic world, there's a real lack of mental health services for people who are from the Islamic communities. We don't have a lot of people in social work or in other fields who have any kinds of degrees or diplomas or licenses to work specifically with people who are from the Islamic world, and that's a problem, okay? A lot of times we don't determine risk and protective factors particularly well because we're basing everything that we do on sort of white middle-class Christian models about how people should behave and what should be available to them. So we need to shift and think about how this might be different for people coming from different countries. And we don't necessarily differentiate between pre- and post-resettlement needs. Most of the literature deals with when people are in resettlement camps and not what happens when they get resettled, okay? And then we also need to do more about trauma-informed care and services. And if you're interested in this, we are having a symposium on Friday where we're going to be talking about trauma-informed care for working with refugees and immigrants. Anyway, it's you just go online to my center's website and you can go ahead and register. Okay, we'd love to have you. Okay, let's see. So we know that of the 5 to 6 million Syrian refugees, 600,000 of them need treatment for serious mental illness, and about 4 million of them have mild to moderate mental health issues. Okay, that's a significant number of people, okay? Of them, 42% have what we call PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, but only 34% of people who were interviewed said that they would actually seek services. Okay, so sometimes just having the services might not be enough, right? 50% of youth from the same study, ages 15 to 24, have considered committing suicide because they've been so distressed. Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. So when we are thinking about the Muslim general outlook on mental health, we got to keep in mind that the Western diagnoses that we make for somebody does not necessarily fit with the Islamic world about how things are seen or perceived, right, and how illness is defined. A number of our people who come in from Iraq, a number of them have diabetes, okay? For us, diabetes is a biomedical issue, right? You go see the doctor, you get insulin, okay, and it's caused because you make too much sugar, you don't make enough sugar, right? Okay, for Iraqi women, it's a fright illness, okay? So they've been frightened in some way, which totally makes sense. If you've been forced to flee, you've seen people killed in front of you, okay? And they got diabetes because it's a fright illness. So there's a completely different mindset or understanding about what it means for this specific illness, okay? And that's one that in the United States, I think we are pretty sure what that looks like, right? So you can imagine for mental health issues, when we're not quite sure what that looks like, there's going to be all kinds of different explanations about what that means. Okay? Okay. All right. So, of course, I have too much stuff, which always happens. So we did an analysis from some Utah Department of Health data, and the data was post-arrival, and was for people 60 and older. We just had this article published from these countries, and the general illnesses that people faced were hypertension, vision, arthritis, and low back pain. Okay, what we know specifically about women who have low back pain is they have experienced some type of a physical trauma, okay? They've been tortured, they've been raped, something else has happened, okay? For men, We see that there's more tobacco use, okay? And tobacco use as well as alcohol use are coping mechanisms for dealing with not being able to protect people, or you yourself may have been tortured, okay? So anyway, these are some of the things that we found with those data. And then for refugees 0 to 59, we're in the process of analyzing those data, and what we have seen right now is that women in those age categories have higher rates of anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, and these are people who are here in Utah. Okay. Okay. All right. So nothing happened. Okay. So here are the things that I think that we've talked about today. So that, the impact of war and conflict on Muslim women is that they have increased susceptibility to mental illness, all right, because of the stress. And it can be, general violence. It can be other types of violence. They may have faced this violence while they were in a camp. They may face it while they're here in their own communities, okay? We have noticed that with one of the communities, many of the women do not drive. And if they need to get somewhere, they will have to ask a male in the community to take them somewhere. And some of the men in the community expect specific types of favors if if he does her this favor of taking her somewhere. So we are trying to take care of this issue, okay? All right. Let's see what else. All right. So here are the things that we need to keep in mind when we are working with women from the Muslim world, okay, when they are being resettled. And the first thing is that they need to have a safe space where they can actually talk about their experiences. A lot of times we say, no, you don't have to talk about that. You don't need to tell me, because we don't want to hear it. But people need to be able to talk about it. They need to be able to say, this is what happened to me. It's not that we need to pressure them to tell their story, but if they are going to tell their story, we need to be respectful and listen, even though some of these things are very, very hard for us to hear, okay? We need to have a recognition of their experiences. I mean, this is really key, that their experience is not the same as my experience. I mean, I grew up in the western part of the United States. I had a great childhood. I never had to move. I wasn't forced out of my community. I didn't see anybody killed in front of my eyes, okay? And we need to be very careful of stereotyping. So a lot of the things that I put up here about mental illness or what people might have faced, maybe these people didn't go through that. Okay, so we just need to be aware that that type of story may not be the story that somebody's going to tell you. Okay? Okay, and we need to develop a variety of communication strategies specifically with healthcare providers, because a lot of healthcare providers don't even really know what to ask people who have come from another country, especially if they are from the Islamic world. Okay, so what I'd like to leave you with is this wonderful quote from David Miliband, who's the CEO of the International Rescue Committee. He's just fantastic. He has a TED Talk where he talks about this, and really the biggest question in the 21st century concerns our duty to strangers. And what he's really implying with that is, what does this say about you if you can't be kind to people who are not like you, okay? So, in the end, what can you do? The first thing that you can do is when you come across somebody who may be a refugee or an immigrant, somebody you don't know, you can say hello. Okay, that does not hurt you to say hello, and people like that, okay? The second thing is, if you are going to see this person over and over again, you might consider making a friend of this person. They're going to bring all kinds of wonderful things to your life that you're not going to anticipate, okay? Listen to what they have to say, and don't judge them, okay, for the things that they tell you. Part of it is when we are not used to hearing what other people have to say, sometimes become a little judgmental, right? Easy to do. Everybody does it, okay? Provide them a safe space. Try not to be too shocked and horrified by what they tell you. And volunteer, okay? If you can volunteer, do some community service, and I'm sure all of you already do this with either the International Rescue Committee, the LDS Church has a humanitarian center, which I'm sure you're all aware of, that does all kinds of wonderful work with refugees and immigrants. Catholic Community Services is another group that does wonderful work. Asian Association of Utah. Find a group that's working with refugees and immigrants and volunteer. Your life will be enriched, and it will be very helpful for people who are trying to integrate into the United States. Okay? Great. Thank you. Okay, and then I have a number of references here, and I know that Professor Meacham can share this. It's all good. I don't care. Okay? Good. Questions?
10 minutes for questions. If you wouldn't mind just coming up, this is being recorded, so we just want to get your voice on the mic.
Hi.
I was just wondering, you were talking earlier about like employment as soon as refugees come over here and how it's easier here than it is in other countries for them. And I was wondering, are the main reasons for that just because here it's easier to find a job, or here because, what was the other reason? Well, I guess I forgot. But like, what would you say is like the biggest reason that is?
That the federal government allows them to get a job. So in
Okay.
Germany, they don't allow them to work. You cannot work for pay because you're not a citizen, you're not an immigrant. There's a number of reasons, and you're not eligible to have a job where you get paid. You can work all you like, but it just won't be for money.
So then as soon as they get citizenship in that country, then they can, and that process usually just takes a few years usually? Or?
Usually, but by that time, I mean, you may be there with your partner, your spouse, right? And you may have children, and you're living in a resettlement house, okay, that somebody else is paying for, but it's usually not just you alone. It's like a barracks, and there are all kinds of people living there, and then the food is taken care of, but you have no say in what the food might be. Everything about what you need, you have no autonomy because you don't get to pay for anything because you don't have a job. Yeah.
That's crazy.
So people are luckier to come to the United States for a variety of reasons, but one of them is they can come in, they're given a green card and a social security number when they get here, and they can start working day one, the minute they can find a job. Now, some of the jobs might not pay a living wage, okay, but you can get a job.
It's already better. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, good question. It was such a pithy talk, no one has any questions? Okay.
Thank you again for coming. My question regards the acculturation or assimilation integration piece, and that is, I think it's common for groups of people when they have either migrated or has come as refugees to congregate in like-minded communities with similar backgrounds. I think on the one hand, that's probably very healthy for them to have that community. Does that have conflicts, though, long-term in terms of reaching out and really connecting in a deeper way with the host culture? And I guess what does that impact if we don't, you don't want to break up that community, but have more ties to the host culture?
No, that's a really good question. Part of what we do in the United States is our resettlement agencies look for inexpensive housing, and it may not group people together from the same country. So we did a study where we could see where refugee women are housed, and they're from different communities, and they're kind of housed all over. So that allows them to interact with the host community, but it doesn't allow them to have that interaction to ask a question of, okay, I don't understand how this works, or I can't figure out how to get there, from somebody who already knows that. So there's two things I've thought about that. We don't want to be creating ghettos like is in Paris, okay, where people who are of North African descent are all congregated and housed in the same place. At the same time, we don't want to disperse people so far they can't maintain those connections. So there's a discussion right now going on in the United States and elsewhere. What is the best housing model that we should be using? Okay, and I don't think we know that right now, because I think it's like those two things, right? You want them to meet people, but you want them to be able to rely on people. So what do we do about that? And if you can come up with an answer for that, that'd be fantastic. It'd be a dissertation waiting to happen.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Thank you.
no, good question. I don't think anybody has another question. Everybody's just thinking. Okay, yay.
I've worked a lot in the Middle East,
Yeah.
and I've worked with a lot of Middle Eastern men. And one thing, I mean, I don't want to overgeneralize, but
Right. Gotta
like
watch
there's a
those
very
stereotypes.
high bar that they feel they have to live up to as
Yeah.
far as like honor.
Yes.
And even like, especially when they're engaging American, I always kind of felt like they're doing like a little posturing game or something. I was like, dude, you don't need to do that. But like when they come here, I can see where they feel so disempowered. Whereas
Right.
like even in their home country where they're perfectly comfortable, it's almost an impossible bar for them to meet
Yes.
as far as like honor and so on.
Yeah.
Like, how does that not end up destroying them psychologically? I mean, I mean, I just don't
It's a
see
problem.
any good solution to that other than say, hey, you don't need to be as honorable as you used to need to be. I don't know.
And it's like, yeah, that probably is not the answer, right? Yeah, okay. No, I think that one of the things that we've seen that works well is that when we have men from the Islamic world meeting other men from the Islamic world who've been here a while, as well as men who were born here, having conversations about, so it's okay that my daughter does that, and or it's okay that my wife is working outside the home, and it's okay that I can't do these things. They're not going to say it that way, but sort of modeling a different behavior and helping people to see that it's okay, things have changed, and it's going to take time. Yeah, but yeah, Middle Eastern men do sort of have a high bar about what they're supposed to be doing, and I don't honestly know how they manage that, even in the best of circumstances in a country where you're born and you've lived there all your life. Yeah, no, it's a very good question. Yes.
Are there any ways that kind of the unique religious environment in Utah affects refugee resettlement in Utah that you've seen?
I think, okay, so specifically for people from the Islamic world, there's lots of commonalities, right? You don't drink alcohol, right? Smoking is just not a thing, although we do see that many men from the Middle East do smoke, right? There's the value on not having intercourse until you are married, and finding the right person, and all kinds of things like that, that not only is your family important, but his family is important, so there's some kind of an integration. So when I grew up, my mom always said, when you get married, you marry his family too, and I know a lot of people don't think that, but it's true, okay? Whether you like it or not, it is true. So I think there's sort of a number of those kinds of commonalities. And I think going back to your point, and with this point, if you can sort of address those commonalities with men who are of refugee status from the Middle East, I think that's going to help them see, so you're kind of dealing with some of the same kinds of things I deal with too. So commonalities, what are the commonalities you have with people? Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, parenting skills. Oh, were you going to get up? Go ahead. I was just going to say, so parenting skills are a thing that a lot of refugee women are worried about because they can't parent here the way they did in their home country, okay? And we were doing a workshop with about 60 refugee women from various cultural groups, and we were talking about parenting, and one of the women raised her hand and she said, okay, what I don't understand is, when does a person become an adult in the United States? I was like, 18, and all 60 women, it's like, no, 18, you're an adult, and as a consequence, as a parent, you don't have as much say over what happens when your child turns 18. And they were all up in arms because somebody from the Burundi community, she had just turned 18 and she married somebody from the host community, and she did it on her own without including her family. Oh, the community was in an uproar, okay, because they said, that would never have happened had we been at home in Burundi, because the whole village would have known who she was seeing. Everybody would have been able to say, you can't do that. You're too young. You haven't asked your parents, all of these kinds of things. And that just doesn't happen here. So there's a whole cultural element about parenting, too, that's, anyway, I just loved it. So I hated to say, well, you're 18, because I knew all 60 women were going to have my head. I just knew it. Yes, you were going to ask a question.
I was just wondering if you see a problem with integration because of the stereotypes that we, like Americans, people in Utah, have about people coming from the Middle East or just those other countries that are sending refugees, and how do you deal with those? Or is it that once somebody knows maybe one Muslim person, they are more open to the rest of them coming in?
Yes. I think that's the key. Meet somebody who's from that group. Because once you meet one person, it's like, oh, you're just like me. Yeah. You have the same ideas, you got the same concerns, you're interested in many similar kinds of things. I think that we have to be very careful of stereotypes, and make sure that when you're meeting a person, you're meeting them as an individual, not as the stereotype that we all know about, right? Okay, because the stereotypes are not especially people that we see on the news, are not necessarily the people from the Middle East that we would want to associate with. in some cases, depending on where they are, right? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank
does
you.
that,
Yeah,
yeah, okay.
that's awesome.
Yeah, that's a good question, okay?
I think our time has come to an end, so if you would be willing to join with me in thanking Professor Frost.
Thank you. And I just want to thank Professor Meacham for setting this all up. I hope we're going to be able to continue this kind of thing. This is wonderful.